plague, cholera, tuberculosis, Ebola. These certainly terrible diseases have claimed a huge number of lives, although they all pale into insignificance when compared to what our today's plot centers on, a contender for the title of the most disastrous and deadliest infection that has ever struck mankind. Please welcome Spanish influenza. Like a grim reaper, it raced around the world. It looked into every nook and cranny, leaving alone no single human settlement. In just a year, it managed to kill more people than the First and Second World Wars together. It was undoubtedly the worst pandemic in human history, but not at all the major one. In percentage terms, about 5% of the total population died of it in the world. Speaking of the plague, every third person died from it in the 14th century. But it was Spanish influenza that topped the list of the most widespread and deadly diseases, since neither quarantine nor precautions had any effect on it. It simply came and, having reaped its sorrowful harvest, disappeared without a trace. Many believed in the end of the world, as it very much resembled the biblical prophecy about a war that would strike the world, followed by famine, and then a rider whose name was Death, and hell would follow him. The virus in some remote villages destroyed up to 95% of the total adult population. The contagiousness and spread of influenza infection were simply tremendous. Victims died 2 or 3 days after getting infected. Sometimes the patients did not live for more than a day. The disease seized people in a matter of days, even hours, and knocked them down completely. A day ago everything was fine, but suddenly your head is splitting. An unbearable shiver runs through your body. Your eyes become inflamed, and the temperature is starting to increase. Hallucinations become more and more delusional. Your sleep becomes increasingly troubled. The complexion turns to purplish brown. There's more tightness in your throat, and as your life is drawing to an end, every breath gets painfully hard. It's like you're underwater. All of a sudden, there is silence. The only sign of life is only a drop of blood flowing down a dark cheek. This is the end. Later, at autopsy, the doctor notices that the patient's lungs are filled with fluid to overflowing. They just could not get oxygen, resulting in the dark color of the feet and face. In 1918, about 30% of the population was infected in the United States. According to U.S. Navy, 40% of the personnel were ill with the Spanish flu, and the average death rate from it was 25 times higher than from the conventional flu we have nowadays. The problem was that the disease was spreading at such a speed that it was simply impossible to determine the aggregate picture of mortality. Besides, in many areas, statistics were just not collected. At a rough estimate, 50 to 100 million people died from the Spanish flu in the world. Although the official figures are, for obvious reasons, much more modest, there is much more that is worth knowing about the 1918 pandemic. It is considered to be the only epidemic of the Spanish flu. However, in reality, it passed around the world in 3 waves, 2 in 1918 and 1 in 1919. The first wave hit the world at the end of the winter of 1918. It all started in the place that caused the virus to be called Spanish. While military battles raged in a burning and dilapidated Europe, it was here, in San Sebastian, a small resort town in the very north of Spain, not far from the border with France, where the abnormal activity of the virus was first recorded. At first, the city authorities did not address the issue seriously. The holiday season was in full swing, and indeed, things were not so bad. 3 days of fever, pain, body aches, and then recovery. The outbreak was considered insignificant, and the mortality rate was not higher than usual, which meant that there was no need to scare away the tourists. The problem, however, was that this was no ordinary flu. Although its first wave was really not that deadly, everyone noticed the lightning-fast infection rate of this disease. After a couple of days, almost everyone who had contact with the sick in one way or another got infected, and the disease became simply impossible to control. Reports of the outbreak began to come from different regions and cities in Spain, and this information quickly found its reader. Within a few weeks, newspapers were full of headlines that city after city of Spain was conquered by the new flu. Just a few months later, it seized almost the entire country. Almost a third of the population of Madrid became infected with the flu, and there were about 8 million people infected nationwide, including King Alfonso XIII. People started firmly associating the flu with Spain. This is the reason why it received such a name. However, the fact that the disease was given a name based on geographical considerations does not mean that the disease appeared in Spain itself. It's just that Spain was a neutral country, and the authorities at first wanted to avoid unnecessary panic. They did not introduce any censorship in the press. But in the USA, Germany, or Great Britain, the news that soldiers kept getting massively infected with some new strange disease could do much harm. Therefore, the countries involved in the war remained silent as long as they could, forbidding any publications about the disease in the newspapers. At the front, it was called the 3-day fever. But according to the recollection of the soldiers, it was not always limited to 3 days. Sometimes it dragged on for a week or even longer. It depends. Unlike the second wave that began in the autumn, the first wave was hardly recorded. Perhaps because it was not so deadly, or maybe because everyone was busy with the war. The disease was actively spreading in military camps. The commanders on all fronts complained in their reports about the low combat capability of their soldiers in light of the fever outbreak. In May, the ships of the United Kingdom fleet could not get underway for 3 weeks due to the fact that more than 10,000 sailors were on the sick list. The famous German general Erich Ludendorff complained about the trench fever, as it was called in Germany. He lamented that the flu weakened the soldiers, who already were not in the best mental and physical condition, and argued that it was the fever that was the reason for the failure of the July attack that was supposed to guarantee Germany's victory in this war. Despite the fact that the first wave was extremely contagious and quite large-scale, it still did not cover the whole world. Canada, Latin America, and most of Africa were practically not affected by it, and that's when the summer came. Long, hot days set in, and the virus, as though disappeared by itself, leaving the military to fight and civilians to hope for a quick end to the war. After summer, autumn came. The war began to move towards an end, but the virus was not going to reckon with the plans of people at all. In the summer, it waited to hit war-weary humanity with renewed vigor. If the first wave was super contagious, then the second, additionally, killed its victims hands down. Approximately 20% of the patients tolerated the flu quite normally. They rested for 3 days and immediately got up on their feet, while all the rest were divided into 2 categories. The first included those whom the disease carried off very quickly, filling their lungs with liquid to capacity. The second category consisted of those who had the flu, as the conventional one, with a fever of 3 or 4 days, although after some time they were overtaken by a no less dangerous bacterial infection, as a result of which severe pneumonia developed, and the patient either died or stayed seriously ill, remaining incapacitated. The beginning of the second wave in America is considered to be August 28, 1918. This happened in Boston, when the first 8 sailors fell ill, and the next day there were already 58 who fell ill. A few days later, the number of sick people grew to 81 people, and a week later, 119 people were on the sick list. Around the same time, on September 8th, the first deaths began. 3 died immediately. On the same day, influenza affected the nearby Fort Devens, and according to one of the doctors, a real living hell set in there. The letter, dated September 29, 1918, with the simple signature Roy, apparently never reached the addressee, was found only 60 years later in some chest in Detroit. Neither the name nor the further fate of the author is known. The letter read as follows. The camp in Devens is located near Boston. About 50,000 people live there. Or rather, they lived before this terrible epidemic broke out. Influenza was brought into the camp 4 weeks earlier and spread so terrifyingly quick that the personnel was completely demoralized, and the entire preparatory program was suspended. Until the situation is improved, a strict ban is imposed on any contact between recruits. Roy writes, the onset of the disease resembles regular flu. But here's what happens after the soldiers have already been delivered to the medical unit. They rapidly develop the most sinister form of pneumonia known to medical science. 2 hours after admission, they have red spots on their cheekbones, and after a few more hours, you can observe how cyanosis begins to spread from the ears all over the face, so that it is impossible to distinguish a white man from a dark-skinned one. Breathing becomes ever more difficult, and the patient dies of suffocation. This is terrible. You can bear the sight of 1 or 2 or even 20 people dying, but these poor fellows drop like flies. This is just mind-blowing. We now register about 100 deaths a day on average, but their number keeps increasing. Even getting rid of the accumulated corpses became a thing. Special trains had to be launched to take out the deceased. The coffins were not delivered for several days and the bodies piled up. Entering the morgue, which is just behind my ward, we could more than once contemplate the unfortunate boys lying in long rows. You will not see this even after the fiercest battle in France. Then the largest barracks were emptied to arrange the morgues there. You could hardly fail to be moved if you happened to walk along the corpses, dressed in uniforms and stacked in piles of 2. No one has been sent to help us so far, and so we get up at 5:30 in the morning, hammer away until 10:30 in the evening, and go to sleep, only for to repeat it all over again tomorrow. Within just a few weeks, such a picture became commonplace nationwide, especially where a huge number of people accumulated, in particular recruits who were supposed to be trained and go to war-torn Europe. Although despite the fact that Army reinforcements were required more than ever, the commanding service made a shocking statement about the cancellation of the draft of 142,000 recruits. They have also announced the introduction of quarantine in all military units where these same recruits were stationed. But there was nothing to be done. The virus broke free and turned a country teeming with life into one huge funeral procession just in a few weeks. It moved step by step from one army unit to another, from city to city, until it reached Philadelphia. At first, the authorities were quick to calm people down, saying that in fact the outbreak was already coming to an end and there was no need to fear and panic. Not only did the authorities not announce quarantine, but they also staged a large-scale parade in honor of raising funds for the War Fund, which was attended by more than 200,000 people. On top of that, the next day the newspaper's headlines began to claim that the scientists had managed to find out the agent of the disease that causes the flu, that very Pfeiffer's bacillus. But as early as October 1st, just that day, public health authorities received a report of 635 flu cases. 3 days later, absolutely all institutions, restaurants, theaters, schools, even churches, were closed in the city. The strictest lockdown was introduced, and people on the streets were warned about the unsafety of sneezing and coughing in public places. Only hospitals and funeral homes worked in an enhanced mode. In just 1 week, Philadelphia recorded 2,600 deaths of the flu or its complications. Within a week, that figure had doubled. Thousands of citizens got infected. Patients were taken to hospitals in whatever way possible, by cars, wagons, and even ordinary wheelbarrows. During the month since the disease had appeared in the city, 11,000 people died from the flu. The saddest day fell on October 10, 1918, when 859 people died from the flu in just 1 day. Funeral homes just couldn't handle the load. Processions could go through the streets all day long. The bodies lay at home for several days. It was literally impossible to find a free funeral service in the city that could bury a body. There were absolutely no places in the morgue. According to Alfred Crosby, an American historian and a specialist in biological and epidemiological history, the bodies were stored in 4 or 5 rows in the city morgue. Even corridors and other rooms were occupied. Moreover, they were mostly covered with dirty, bloody sheets. Most were not embalmed. There was also not enough ice, and the corpses decomposed, spreading a sickening stench around. The doors of the building were almost constantly kept open for better ventilation. Philadelphia is perhaps the most affected city in America, where the virus managed to go on a spree. As for compact communities, a huge number of people died there. On some islands, up to 30% of adults died. A clear example of this is the village near the Lutheran Mission in Teller, Alaska. The disease arrived here at the end of November, when 2 guests came to the chapel, reporting that the flu had broken out in the nearby town of Nome. The Eskimos received their guests according to all the traditions, but did not pay much attention to the information about the disease. Flu? What's the big deal? Just a couple days later, the first person in the village fell ill, followed by the first death the very next day. The priest immediately went to Teller, which was only 14 miles away, for help, as every day the disease claimed more and more lives. Although returning to the village, he realized that there was no one to save, and there was nothing to cure them. The disease could neither be cured by prayers nor by conjurations. During those days, almost the entire adult population died in the village. Only 5 surviving adults and 47 children remained. A total of 72 people died. For a long time, even burying the corpses was quite a challenge, because this is the permafrost of Alaska. They were put in a separate igloo to be buried later, but the dogs, furious with hunger, broke into the igloo and tore apart several corpses. This situation was similar in all neighboring villages. The Spanish flu walked the planet without dividing people into friends and foes, good and bad. However, it killed mainly the young population. This mysterious disease had claimed the lives of about 20 million people in India alone, and after 100 years, there are more questions than answers. Despite the vast nature of the pandemic, there is little to no memory of those truly horrific events in the public mind. According to Crosby's polls, most people considered the 1918 pandemic to be something local and exclusively inherent in their city, village, or even the street. Another event of those times is firmly engraved in the memory of every person, community, and family. It was the horrors of war that found a wide response in the public mind. Thousands of works of art, autobiographies, and memoirs. These events are still included in all history books as the most important events of those times. But as far as the deadly Spanish flu is concerned, only a couple of words can be found even in the best textbooks. The question also remains why the first wave of the Spanish flu turned out to be so minor, while the second wave took a more dangerous turn. The Spanish flu differed from its predecessors in the fact it affected mostly young people, aged 17 to 45. But why was it the case? After all, we're accustomed to associating the flu with something non-threatening and certainly not so serious, especially for a young body. And the most important question is, where did it come from? After all, the Spanish flu pandemic is not the first and far from the last case of a pandemic in the history of mankind. Influenza, as a phenomenon, firmly entered life and confidently settled in it, getting on the pages of chronicles from time to time, both ancient authors and authors of medieval Europe. And in order to understand how the Spanish flu managed to cause so much trouble in such a short time, and how we can avoid such disasters in the future, we should first find out where it came from. In search of an answer, let's run a little over 70 years back, in 1951, to a remote corner of America, Alaska, which the Spanish flu affected with all its might in 1918, sometimes killing up to 90% of the adult population and destroying the local residents' routine. In order to understand the situation better, let's look at it through the eyes of a young enthusiast named Johann Hulton. He was an exchange student and moved to the United States with his wife in 1949 to work and study. Indeed, According to him, America was a country of freedom, free from class stereotypes and conservatism, characteristic of Swedish science of that time. And since they were light on foot and they still had a lot of time to spend in America, they decided to travel the country. They borrowed a small Studebaker car from the wife's relatives and hit the road. After visiting 48 states, Johan and his wife decided to move north to Alaska. They had to go through Canada, and when half of the country was already behind them, it turned out that in order to continue the journey along the Alaska Highway, they had to obtain a pass from the Ministry of Defense. However, just at that time, the Canadian government opened the highway to civilians, and the couple was able to head on. When they got to Fairbanks, Alaska, they were incredibly lucky again. They met with a paleontologist named Otto Gates, who offered them to work for him for several weeks and master the difficult craft of a digger in permafrost on top of everything else, which our hero would soon need very much. Now you're probably thinking, what's the whole story about? And what does it have to do with the flu virus? But if you were an attentive reader before, you probably already begin to take a guess. What is this all about? While you're thinking, I'll continue. Having returned to Iowa, Holton began his studies at the university, where he eventually won the respect of his colleagues and professors by inventing a mechanism for automatically turning off a gas burner, which was a lifesaver in laboratory conditions. One day, he was invited to dinner in honor of William Hale, the famous virologist from the National Laboratory in New Haven, who came to the university. Holton was introduced to him exactly as the very person who modernized the Bunsen burner, which made the work of probably all the laboratories in the world easier. That day, Hale uttered words about the Spanish flu pandemic that were destined to become prophetic and stuck in Holton's mind for years to come. It seems that everything possible has already been done to shed light on the source of the epidemic, but we still do know nothing about the causative agent of this disease. The only thing we can do now is to go to the northern regions of the world and try to find bodies in the permafrost that are preserved well enough to still contain the flu virus. Fortunately, a little earlier, Holton, who prowled the permafrost, had already succeeded in establishing contacts with local residents and gained sufficient knowledge to detect this virus and, most importantly, to dig it out. He immediately began planning the project, working with maps and defining the places where burials were to remain in the permafrost. Perhaps a virus that could be isolated and studied was still there, in the lungs of corpses. And then, on the basis of this knowledge, it would be possible to create a vaccine and prevent future pandemics of this terrible disease. Besides, he could finally understand what actually made the Spanish flu virus so deadly. Holton shared the idea with his supervisor, the rector, and other university specialists, and told them that he and his wife had previously studied the soil of these places, and that he had sufficient skills and, most importantly, great enthusiasm to deal with this task. The idea was much appreciated, and the college management approved working out a plan to exhume the bodies from the permafrost and deliver them to the laboratory for further study. First off, Holton telegraphed his good friend Gates to Alaska. He had the key to solving the issue, in which not only Holton was interested by that time, but also a group of scientists. It was Gates, with his unquestioned authority among the local population, who had to find out from the Eskimos the complete lists of people who died that year. But it was still half the battle. It was necessary to persuade the Eskimos to give their permission to disentomb, and Holton, with the help from Gates, began a correspondence with Alaskan Christian missions representatives. But things did not go so smoothly. In many villages, no lists had been preserved, because those settlements were affected quite badly. And in that chaos, no one had the strength or time to keep records. It was necessary to take care of the burial, establish a new life in the village, and take care of the numerous orphans. That's not to mention that the flu did not spare the missionaries who were supposed to keep records. To start work, it was necessary to clearly define the places where the alleged burials could be located. Holton gained access to Army and technology archives He managed to come up with a plan. There were only 3 settlements where there were lists of those who died from influenza, and the bodies were buried in permafrost. By that time, a whole year had already passed, and it was time to get ready for a journey. Finally, all the members of the group, including Holton, his supervisor McKee, and Jack Layton, a university pathologist, headed to Alaska, where they were met by Otto Gates, their faithful assistant and friend of the Eskimos. They carried wide-mouthed thermoses filled with dry ice, and their only task was to quickly get to the burial places and get those lung samples that had been buried in this icy land for 30 years. They put up exactly where Holton and his wife had stayed 2 years earlier. It was decided that the head and initiator of this expedition had to make a reconnaissance himself. However, bad weather lurked at them from the very beginning. It started to rain, and they had to wait. Day after day passed, and the rain never stopped. A new problem has arisen. The dry ice in the thermos began to evaporate. They hadn't expected to be here for so long, and by the time the ice could melt, they should have been long back in Iowa. About 2 weeks passed, and there was almost nothing left of the dry ice. Try to find dry ice in Alaska. The task is not easy. They were really upset, but the problem was suddenly solved. Holton suddenly remembered that carbon dioxide fire extinguishers, when used, emitted a jet of white matter, which was dry ice, only in the form of a fine powder. Then they cheered up and stocked up on fire extinguishers. By this time, it had stopped raining. Holton went straight to Nome, the city in Alaska where the Spanish flu broke out. It was the perfect place for exploration. Permafrost, a large Lutheran mission which regularly kept all records of the pandemic victims. But in fact, everything was not as rosy as it seemed. The river flowing through the town had changed its course so much over the past years that it came close to the edge of the cemetery, and there was almost no chance that permafrost remained there. To check, Holton dug a hole next to the grave, and there was no permafrost there. What is permafrost? It is quite well described by this word and represents a forever dead, frozen ground. But there is a thaw from time to time, and one summer the soil may thaw out 2 feet deep, and the next 6 or even 8 feet. And over such a long period of time, several cycles of warm weather have passed. Besides, the victims were not necessarily buried at great depths, where there is always permafrost. This was the key challenge. Holton had to leave this place and move on. He reached the next point of the expedition, to the village of Wells, which was located in the westernmost part. This village suffered greatly from the epidemic, and upon arrival at the place, he discovered a similar picture that he faced in Nome, a mass grave in which 178 residents of the village were buried. In 1918, the cemetery was far from the water, but over time, the ocean washed away the shore so much that the burial appeared right next to it. Holton tried to dig and was right in his assumptions. There was no permafrost, and there was little hope that undecomposed remains could be found here. So Holton went to the last place where there was at least some chance that the bodies were preserved, to Breivik. It was here that out of 80 people of the adult population of the village, only 5 remained in 1918. There were so many dead people that for a long time it was a problem just to bury all the bodies. It took the locals 2 whole months, and even then, it was only possible after a brigade of miners from Nome arrived here to help. Holton received permission for the exhumation from the head of the Christian mission and immediately began excavations. 4 days later, he was able to dig a hole 6 feet deep. The first thing he discovered was the body of a little girl with pigtails. After examining the body, he realized that it was time to call for help. They arrived 2 days later, and the work began. In the end, they achieved their goal. They found many well-preserved remains and delivered them with honor to the University of Iowa. This story immediately gained publicity in the media. Holton and other members of the expedition even gained popularity. Then followed a no less time-consuming and no less risky task: to isolate the virus. I would be glad to say that Holton managed to do it, but no. He could not succeed no matter how hard he tried. He minced tissues, placed them in a saline solution, spun them in a centrifuge to separate the virus from impurities, added antibiotics to accurately separate it from bacteria, then transplanted it into an embryonated egg, and so on, hundreds of times. He spent a month and a half on this, used up almost all the available material, and could not keep still, waiting for the results. He really wanted to justify the efforts he made for the expedition. He tried experimenting with ferrets as well, but nothing worked. None of the methods worked. It became obvious that the virus was dead. Holton's disappointment knew no bounds. So, at the beginning of the 50s, Johann Holton gradually leaves the Great Flu Hunters Order. But you probably thought, why did you tell us this story if it ultimately did not result in anything? But do not rush to conclusions. All in due time. Now, we should fast forward 40 years from the events described. Exactly the same number of years, no one tried to repeat Holton's adventure. The experience of previous researchers had shown that it is pointless to count on the fact that a living virus can still survive in bodies in permafrost. By that time, the Asian flu virus had already died down in the world. Humanity overcame smallpox, and another deadly villain, the immunodeficiency virus, bared its fangs. It seemed that no one else would make any attempts to identify the Spanish flu virus and try to solve all its puzzles. But in the 90s, the growing threat of a new pandemic manifested itself, and fears about a deadly new strain of bird flu no longer kept infectious disease specialists up at night. Thoughts about the resurrection of the Spanish flu virus had been in the air. They wanted to get answers. But how? In the same good old way, by digging out the buried bodies from the permafrost. Then to build the complete nucleotide sequence from a partially preserved genome using a new polymerase chain reaction technology. This was not possible until recently, but today's science has grown to build a complete sequence of nucleotides from an incomplete dead virus, and even revive it. But just like 40 and 50 years ago, scientists needed material. It would probably be wrong to say that when the virus swept across the planet in such large-scale waves in 1918, people did not leave any samples in the pathoanatomical archives at all. In fact, there were enough samples. In 1918, lung tissue sections were placed in university storage facilities at military units, etc., everywhere in the world. Around the 90s, a scientist, Jeffrey Taubenberger, completely unknown in the study of influenza, who was in charge of one small laboratory, found an article that described the study of hereditary blindness, based on the study of the eye of John Dalton himself, who personally described this disease. Now it's called Daltonism in his honor. John himself suffered from this disease, being colorblind. He diligently tried to study his illness and understand why this was happening, but he ran into natural barriers. He simply could not take and cut out his eye in order to examine it under a microscope in detail. That's why he entrusted his assistant with cutting out his eye after his death and studying whether he really looked at the world all his life as if through a color filter. He thought that the liquid in his eye, the so-called vitreous humor, was not transparent, like everyone else's, but cloudy or even blue. When Dalton died, the time had come to test his hypothesis. In the end, he turned out to be wrong. He had the most ordinary eye. So, the essence of the Jeffrey experiment was to use PCR to create a complete genome, compare it with others, and understand in which gene the mutation happened and what kind of colorblindness Dalton suffered. Jeffrey Taubenberger was contemplating how to use this knowledge and experimental methods for the benefit of mankind and science. And in light of wake-up calls coming from China and virology's fear of a new global influenza pandemic, Jeffrey Taubenberger realized that all efforts needed to be focused on the 1918 flu virus. He believed that if he could isolate part of the genome from the lungs of those who died in 1918, he would be able to read all the riddles of this pandemic. Along with his assistant, Anne Reed, Taubenberger first of all drew attention to the repository of the Army Institute of Pathology, which was created by Lincoln personally. It was Lincoln who ordered Army doctors to preserve tissues and other samples of patients whose cases were atypical and incomprehensible. Lung tissue samples of 77 soldiers who died during the Spanish flu were stored there. Jeffrey assembled his lab team, explained the problem, and the work began. Over the years of painstaking work, they have experienced both disappointment and failure. Around the same time, another enthusiast for the 1918 flu pandemic emerged. A young lady named Kirsty Duncan took interest in it. She was aware of the work being done in this direction and of the failures, including those that Jeffrey's team had experienced in their lab. She knew that there was an acute shortage of tissue samples. Kirsty was a geographer who taught at several Canadian universities and knew exactly where to search. She studied climate change and its impact on humans. When she set out to find out if tissue samples from those who died of Spanish flu remained anywhere in Canada, she found that the samples were quite small. Wherever Kirsty called, they always answered that there was no material. Then she wondered where else she could get samples. As a geographer, she knew the answer: in permafrost, exactly where Johann Hulton searched at his time. It seemed to her more promising to start with Alaska. But, alas, she did not have such acquaintances who once helped Hulton, and the U.S. Geological Association did not have detailed maps of the permafrost zones in order to navigate somehow. Then she turned her eyes to Iceland, but its geothermal springs made this venture almost impossible, so she abandoned this option. She even tried to write to Russian Siberia, but received no answer at all. Then Kirsty set her eyes upon Norway, the island of Svalbard, where several miners died during the pandemic. She began to hope. She phoned the local coal company and asked them for lists of those who died during that period. They disappointed her that they did not save anything from that time, but offered to redirect her to a local teacher who might have kept the archives. This time she was very lucky. The archives were still preserved. Duncan called the teacher, and he agreed to provide several records that spoke of 7 miners who fell victim to the 1918 affliction. She was very happy. Kirsty Duncan turned to the press, and after a while, after she found the graves of those unfortunate miners, the whole world knew about it. The public reaction was sometimes more powerful than from modern outbreaks of various diseases. Literally, the whole world was talking about the hunt for the deadly Spanish flu virus. Duncan immediately assembled a team of the most respected Spanish flu experts, received funding, and began to develop a detailed plan to exhume the bodies from the permafrost. This time, the mission was significantly different from those undertaken by enthusiasts earlier. By the mid-90s, humanity was no longer so frivolous about various deadly viruses. And as the hype around this whole situation has gained a worldwide scale, there was only one thing that was interesting: whether this virus would break free after so many years of hibernation and whether this would lead to new troubles. Security concerns delayed the expedition for several years. Meanwhile, Jeffrey Taubenberger continued his work methodically, and after a series of publications, the attention of this field's scientists was drawn to him. Duncan simply could not ignore his work, as she was going on an expedition for the samples that Jeffrey was already working with. At some stage, some expedition members' faith that their case makes any sense at all began to shake. But Jeffrey's business was actually not so good. He was sorely lacking in material. All this hype around the influenza virus forced a person who had long calmed down and had time to be disappointed in this business to get involved in the matter. And that guy was Johann Hulton. All these long years he languished in the shadows and carefully studied all the scientific literature in the field of microbiology. Science already had methods for resurrecting dormant in the abyss of time viruses. The PCR method was widely used in laboratories, and the works of Jeffrey Taubenberger were of great scientific importance. Meanwhile, Kirsty Duncan's mission progressed too slowly. Due to the situation hitting the headlines, more new problems arose every day. With security, with public opinion of the situation. All processes had to be carried out according to the latest safety rules and regulations. Before the exhumation, it was necessary to find out with the help of a new scanning system whether the graves of the miners were exactly there. Then it was necessary to provide biological protection according to the most advanced standards. That is, it was not enough just to come, as Holton did in his time, and start digging. It was necessary to organize an on-site laboratory equipped with a negative pressure ventilation system to equip it with almost spacesuits, and all this would certainly be approved. As a result, the mission was delayed. It was 1997, and a March article by Taubenberger spurred Holton into action. He contacted Jeffrey and offered him something incredible. On their own, without anyone else's participation, to go to Alaska and manually dig up the remains of the Eskimos who died from the Spanish flu. The offer was, to put it mildly, mind-blowing. Holton understood this as well. Therefore, in his letter, he was very restrained and constantly justified himself that he was not an old man who had gone out of his mind, who, in his declining years, came up with a crazy idea. Jeffrey was slightly shocked. He asked Holton when he planned to leave for Alaska. He thought that the old man would need more than 1 month, or even a year, to arrange and prepare everything, and perhaps he would give up his plan. Although, what was his surprise when the old Swede assured him that he could go literally next week? Holton's selflessness had an explanation. He wanted to pull off a deal as quickly as possible without wasting time on trifles. He wanted to have time to complete what he had started. Holton took full responsibility. He was retired. He didn't have to risk his career. He just could not stand publicity and promised to do everything at his own expense. Everything was supposed to be done in complete secrecy. No one but the two of them will know about the expedition. Holton planned to get the samples on his own, and Jeffrey's task was only to accept the material. And so the adventure began. Holton went to Alaska. Upon arrival, he engaged in negotiations with the local population and obtained permission to exhume the bodies buried in a mass grave back in 1918. He mentioned that he had already come there with his mission in 1950, showed photos of the last expedition. Holton was very persuasive, saying that this mission would help to avoid such troubles in the future and that it might be possible to get a vaccine and save thousands of people. In the end, Holton received their consent. Several people from the local town volunteered to help him, which greatly facilitated his work. After some time, they found the first body, but there was no soft tissue preserved. The excavations have been going on for 3 days. They've gone deep into the permafrost, but nothing was left. Already disappointed, Holton stumbled upon the body. It turned out to be a woman's. Due to the fact that she was very thick and buried deep in the permafrost, frozen adipose tissue was preserved. It was a great piece of luck. After taking samples, he left as quickly as he arrived in Alaska. Upon returning home, he sent the samples to Taubenberger by mail. Moreover, he divided them into several parts because he was afraid that the package might get lost and not reach him, which would mean an invaluable loss for science. In general, it's funny that Holton sent samples of one of the most dangerous viruses in the world by regular mail. After all, the beginning of Kirsty Duncan's expedition was delayed for 4 whole years, precisely because they tried to ensure the safety of the expedition so that the virus by no means breaks free and causes trouble. Instead, a pensioner, alone, did what a whole team of professionals had been preparing for 4 years. And this time, Holton could proudly reap the fruits of his labor. The perfectly preserved samples were put to good use and helped Taubenberger to completely sequence the genome of the 1918 virus, which lifted the veil of mystery that has plagued scientists for decades. But let's return to Kirsty's expedition. Finally, it took place. It was not an exhumation, but a performance. Both scientists with their equipment and workers and hundreds of journalists and TV reporters arrived at the scene. Duncan's phone rang every minute. During the exhumation, she constantly had to give interviews and hold press conferences every morning. But no matter how much hype there was around this case in the media and in the scientific world, the results were not encouraging. The ground pushed the coffins into the upper layer during the thaw and subsequent freezing, and they were already outside the permafrost zone, which meant the mission was a washout. It was almost impossible to find the surviving necessary tissues. So the 5-year preparation, large funding, and mobilization of almost all the media have sunk into oblivion almost in vain. However, during this time, new methods of safe work with such dangerous viruses were developed that were generally useful for science. After all, science does not always mean some kind of tremendous accomplishment. It happens quite often. Sometimes to achieve a result, you have to suffer 1,000 defeats, which unfortunately was one of those cases. 7 years later, Jeffrey Taubenberger managed to find out the full chain of the Spanish influenza virus. It happened on October 6, 2005. This was confirmed by articles in 2 of the most popular scientific journals in the world, Science and Nature. The publications said that Jeffrey and his team managed to decipher the full sequence of the Spanish flu virus, and that they were able to recreate this monster in the laboratory. Not only recreate, but also use the virus to infect mice and human lung tissue grown in a petri dish. For Johann Holten, the journey of 55 years ended successfully. Jeffrey Taubenberger worked for good reason too. That said, before publishing the research results and the entire virus gene sequence, they had to take permission to recreate this virus because it posed a significant threat to mankind. It was a strain of the H1N1 virus. Taubenberger noted that the Spanish flu virus is a classic bird flu virus that mutated into a human around the turn of the century, gradually changing the structure of its surface proteins hemagglutinin and neuraminidase so as to be transmitted directly from person to person, which made it so dangerous for us. And I must say, for this, the Spanish flu virus only needed small changes in 25 to 30 of its 4,000 amino acids, and the virus has become a merciless killing machine. Of course, this was influenced by many factors. For example, the fact that the virus was, in fact, contained in birds until 1918. Perhaps that is why people did not understand why everyone gets sick at once and were looking for answers in natural anomalies. And perhaps because a large number of people had to move from one country to another, thus violating the quarantine. So, Australia was affected by the 3rd wave of the influenza. And not only Australia, a lot of other countries too. Australia maintained a strict quarantine in 1918, but when the war ended and the soldiers began to return home in droves, the pandemic seized it with renewed vigor. Plus, the difficult conditions of trench warfare, when soldiers had to stay in dirty trenches for a long time without access to medical care, not to mention observance of quarantine regulations. The body's abnormal reaction to the new strain also took its toll. The fact that the 1918 flu killed mostly young people was because it quickly triggered an overactive immune response in the body, the so-called cytokine storm. This reaction makes vulnerable those who are young, full of energy, and whose immune system is ready for action, while the elderly, with their weak immune systems, suffer less. Well, the lack of antibiotics was also a big problem at that time. Now we know that if we suddenly have a risk of developing pneumonia associated with the flu or a cold, we are very likely to cure such a person. Although this condition is still dangerous, antibiotics had not yet been even invented at that time, and the risk of dying from complications was extremely high. The low mortality of the elderly in the 1918 pandemic is also explained by the fact that the previous generation, born in the 19th century and who experienced the Russian flu pandemic of 1891 to 1892, developed immunity. But, in fact, after so many years of exploring, there are still a lot of questions. Can we prevent the next pandemic? Whether one of them can become the mankind knell? Health to all of us. Sincerely yours, Dr. PopMed.